does have rules. This war was genocidal because of the bombing of hospitals, refugee camps, and marketplaces. In one of the worst bombings in a place called Otuocha Aguleri, I think it's in modern-day Anambra State, in one single day, about approximately 500 civilians were slaughtered. The war was also genocidal because of the rape of girls and women, the starvation of civilian populations, the murder of hundreds of unarmed boys and men in Asaba, economic blockades, and also importantly, post-war economic victimizations and the seizure of property and businesses. The war would go on to claim an additional, estimates put this at up to 3 million lives. There are some important factors to take into account when we think about genocides. Genocides are predominantly the result of animosity and prejudice against an ethnic, religious, racial, or other group based on unfounded fears and perceived threats. In this regard, I would like to refer to here is usually unfounded. And these are things that many of us here, if not all of us here in this room, can relate to. Also important is the fact that acts of genocide are almost always instigated by a political or religious leader. It's hardly the people themselves. Usually people live in harmony until acts of genocide are provoked by respected religious or political leaders. Another important aspect of genocide, and I'll put all of this together, is the fact that you must justify killing people. You have to justify your hatred for them. So you have to make up stories, and they're usually slanted and biased. They are greedy. They are thieves. They are liars. They're rapists. They like money too much. I've heard that one. As if there's any group of Nigerians who don't like money. Also important is the fact that the methods of elimination are brutal and vicious. They involve everything from massacre to torture, mutilation, poisoning, the use of disease, deportation, confinement, starvation, deprivation of political influence. Your political powers are taken from you, or your economic powers. You impose economic stagnation on a group of people. You take away from them their means of livelihood, or you occupy their lands and take over their lands. Now, like I said yesterday, occupation doesn't have to be physical. People can stay hundreds of miles away and exploit your oil or other resources. They don't have to be on your land. Now, to fully understand the use of genocide or mass murder as a weapon to get what people want in Nigeria, we need to look at history. And the aspect of history that I'd like to look at is the history of Islam in Nigeria. Now, when I talk about Islam, I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying anything bad about the faith. However, the manner in which a religion is introduced to a group of people determines the way it is perceived, the way it is utilized, and perhaps the way it is exploited.
Can you connect to radio?
I'm also going to talk about the Fulani who spread Islam, or who introduced Islam. Primarily, they primarily introduced Islam to northern Nigeria. I'll talk about that again without generalizing, I'm not talking about every single Fulani person out there. When we talk about racism in America, it's largely been executed, if you like, by people of European descent. But even when you talk about it, you can't generalize about all white people or people of European descent. However, back to Islam and the way it spread. In a place like Ghana, it spread largely through trade, through Hausa-speaking traders and the Mande people and other people. However, in Nigeria, it spread violently through the Fulani, and this is extremely significant. You would, if you reflect or think about it, there's hardly been any instance of violence or mass killings in Ghana involving Muslims, or you hardly hear of clashes between Muslims and other religious groups. It has a lot to do with how the faith was introduced. It was largely peaceful means. However, like I said, it spread in Nigeria, through northern Nigeria, largely through violence. Now, history tells us, and the dates may differ from person to person, that it was from around the 5th century that the Fulani would begin to migrate from areas around Morocco and Mauritania to settle in parts of Senegal in a place called Futatoro, and eventually they spread out. Now, from the 11th century, when Islam began to gain a stronghold in West Africa, the Fulani would embrace this faith. And as they embrace Islam, it would transform their interaction with people who they begin to see as infidels that they have a right to conquer, dominate, and convert. And so they begin to conquer territories from around the 17th century, around Senegal and Guinea. And then eventually they would begin to move eastward from maybe around the 16th century and would settle in what we understand to be the Hausa Kingdom in present-day Nigeria. And between 1804 and 1808, Usman Dan Fodio would carry out a jihad in Hausa land. He was successful. He conquered the entire region except the Borno Empire, and he set up the Sokoto Caliphate, the original name being the Fula Sokoto Caliphate. The larger Hausa population came under Fulani control, and many were enslaved. Attempts by the Fulani to conquer territories southward was resisted by powerful territories like the Benin Kingdom and the Oyo Empire, even though they did make incursions eventually into the Oyo Empire, or at least parts of the Oyo Empire. And today you have a significant number of Muslims in southwest Nigeria. It was difficult for them to move south, partly because of the Middle Belt. The Middle Belt, because of its mountainous terrain, was a problem for the Fulani who fought on horseback. These were one of the first groups of West Africans to fight on horseback. So that slowed them down. However, by the 17th century, they were politically dominant in many parts of Africa. That includes a section of the great empire of Mali that they conquered and created what would eventually become the Massina Empire. They also conquered Timbuktu. And eventually, they would split up into emirates. Their empire would split up into emirates across the region. And today, they occupy several West and Central African countries, including the Sudan and even coastal areas around the Red Sea. They would also be slowed down by colonialism and by their defeat in places like Nigeria by the British. But here are important things to understand about this history. First of all, we understand from this history that the Fulani were very skilled fighters who fought on horseback. As they conquered and settled in new areas,